It would be.
Feeling of love or feeling of freedom or...
If you had that full for a complete hour, would you still be blissed out, or would you sort of be going, oh?
I think I would miss.
Yeah? Okay. Check.
No, it's scary because that's what I think.
No, we're talking about things. We're not talking. I mean, of course, we talked about the emotion. Yeah, an emotion.
Yeah. And happiness is kind of emotion.
Not really. It's not an emotion as such. What you will find, of course, is that things like love and compassion are sort of in line with that genuine happiness, but we're talking about pleasant, unpleasant, and so forth,
so
which is a little bit different.
Why we look at the mind and feelings then?
Sorry?
Why?
Well, because feelings is pleasant, unpleasant, neutral.
So love is pleasant.
Sorry?
So feeling love is pleasant.
And then just look. That pleasant feeling.
I don't understand.
Sorry?
I don't understand. So looking, it's in the base of, it's in the basis of happiness. It's in the
Good. Keep looking then. Good. Good. I mean, there's no right or wrong answer. It's what you experience. Because it's not like I have to tick the boxes. So, like a scientist, we have to keep running this experiment again and again and again.
Of course, I can feel love and be sad at the same time, but it's still in the basis of happiness, in the nature of happiness.
It's in the nature of happiness. Then keep looking and see if that's really the case. I mean, we just keep looking. Keep looking. That's what we're doing. It's not like we look once and we say, okay, it's like that. Tick, what's next? I mean, that's not insight. That's just a little experience. So we have to keep doing. Keep refining the equipment. And then maybe if we refine the equipment, we come to a different experience. So we just need to keep doing this. That's why Vipashyana, we need to keep doing it. Right, let's go to this evening's topic, which I'll keep brief. And it's just sort of setting up the context for now, the next couple of days. So we said that really the foundation of all Buddhist traditions are these Four Noble Truths. And in these Four Noble Truths, what we saw was that the goal of the spiritual path is just liberation from all suffering and its causes. That goal is often referred to as nirvana. And we saw there that the insight that we are to cultivate to really achieve that goal is this insight into know self, which we'll be looking at in more detail first thing tomorrow morning. And that these Four Noble Truths teachings are really the foundation of the modern day, what's called Theravada Buddhist traditions. And that's coming from the original Pali texts, written in Pali. But also, the Buddha taught many things to many people. And he also taught what's called the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, teachings. And in these perfection of wisdom teachings, the Buddha also taught about this further goal of enlightenment. And we'll look at the difference of the two, I think tomorrow or the next day it comes up. And here, then the Vipashyana practice, the insight we need to cultivate to strive for that goal of enlightenment is this insight into emptiness. And these perfection of wisdom teachings really form the basis of the modern day, what's called Mahayana Buddhist traditions. And that's coming from, spread through the Sanskrit language. So when Buddhism first spread from India, it spread into Sri Lanka, and then up through Southeast Asia, through Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and so forth. And it's these teachings that spread through the Pali language to those countries. So those countries now are collectively called the Theravada Buddhist traditions, and if they go back to the original text, they're written in the Pali language, and the goal of the spiritual path there is nirvana. And to achieve that, we need to realise this no self. Whereas then a little bit later, when Buddhism spread up over the Himalayas onto the Silk Route, the core of the teachings there that spread were these perfection of wisdom teachings, and it spread across then into China, Korea, Japan, down to Vietnam, and then again over the Himalayas into Tibet. And so these Buddhist traditions now are collectively called the Mahayana Buddhist traditions. And when Buddhism was transmitted from India, it was through the Sanskrit language. And again, in these teachings, perfection of wisdom teachings, the Buddha went a little bit further than in the Four Noble Truths. Because the Four Noble Truths, what's the fundamental ignorance? The distorted view of reality is grasping to self. Whereas here, the Buddha went on to say, well, actually, how we see the world is also a problem. There is no independent objective world there, and no independent subjective me here. And so then he taught this idea of emptiness, meaning there is no independent me, independent world. And also then, of course, the idea that we can achieve that further goal of enlightenment, which is a further step than nirvana, and we'll look at what the difference there is, I think tomorrow or maybe the next day it comes up. And so what we're going to do, what we've been doing today, of course, is really focusing mainly here with the impermanence and the suffering just now. Of course, they are common to the Mahayana as well. Of course, in Mahayana we come to realise impermanent suffering. And then also tomorrow morning we'll be looking at the third of those three insights into no self. So that's also the core of the Theravada Buddhist traditions. And then we will later tomorrow move on to this insight into emptiness, the insight that there is no independent me, no independent world. So that will be later tomorrow and then day 8. And then also here within the Mahayana, particularly when Buddhism spread to Tibet, we have a number of schools of Tibetan Buddhism being formed. The first school of Buddhism that formed in Tibet was around the 8th century, called the Nyingma school of Tibetan Buddhism. And the great Indian master who brought Buddhism into Tibet was Padmasambhava, who we quoted a little bit from in the first half of this retreat. And the system of practice that he brought into Tibet was called Dzogchen. And then a few centuries later, some more Indian masters came into Tibet with other systems of practice, and we have the other three schools being formed. The first is the Kagyu. And the system of practice that was brought into Tibet there is called Mahamudra. And then we have the Sakya school. And the system of practice that was brought into Tibet there is called Lamdre. And then finally, the final school formed in Tibet is called the Gelug school of Tibetan Buddhism. Which I think a number of you are maybe more familiar with, because the system of practice that was brought into Tibet there by the great Indian master Lama Atisha is called Lam Rim, the stages of the path to enlightenment.
What are the differences between them?
That's coming right now. So, when we talk, and of course all of these schools of Tibetan Buddhism are within the Mahayana, of course, so they're all talking about the goal of enlightenment and this wisdom of emptiness. One of the differences here is that how we come to this insight into emptiness, we can investigate anything really. But what we find is that in the Gelug school of Tibetan Buddhism, when we come to the Vipashyana practice of emptiness, generally they recommend investigate the person, me the person. Is there an independent me here? So we start the investigation by investigating person. Whereas in both the Nyingma and Kagyu, when they do Vipashyana practice for emptiness, they investigate the mind directly. And so both Dzogchen and Mahamudra are often called nature of mind practices because we are using the mind as the focus for coming to this insight into emptiness. So what we're going to be doing is when we start this emptiness explanation a little bit later tomorrow, we'll sort of follow the classic approach initially within the Gelug school, because that's where I did a lot of my studies. But then what I'd like to do a little bit later on day 9 is then look at this, to look at the emptiness, the Vipassana practice of emptiness from this perspective in terms of nature of mind. So we'll get sort of 2 flavours of how to gain the insight into emptiness, first based on looking for me, the person, and then looking for the mind.
What do you mean the person?
Me, the person.
The body or the...
No, the person. It's a person. Oh, you're a person?
I don't know, I have a body, I have a mind. This is
Yeah, but you say I.
Yes.
You're looking for the I. The I that has the body and the mind. That. We're looking for that. I. Me.
No
So, yeah, so what we're going to see, and this is one of the first topics tomorrow morning, I mean, no self is the same as selflessness, it's the same word. However, no self or selflessness can have a number of meanings. And so we're going to have a look at that, because no self here and no self here don't mean the same thing. And we're going to have a look at that tomorrow morning.
Did that about the Pali and Sanskrit traditions proliferate during the time of the Buddha?
After. Yeah. So first it was the Pali first went to Sri Lanka. That was the first dissemination out of India, a little bit after the time of the Buddha. And then following that, following that, and sort of contemporary then later, the other, I think, Pali in Southeast Asia happened because the Buddha was about 4th, 5th century BC, and then it was about 2 centuries later that it went to Sri Lanka. But then it was like I think from about the 2nd century on, it went up through Myanmar and that way. And then the Sanskrit, I think, roughly started again about the 1st, 2nd century over the Himalayas into the Silk Route. So from about 1st, 2nd century on till 4th, 5th century, we had that slow dissemination into China, Korea, Japan, Vietnam. But then it was a little bit later, beginning 8th century, that it went over the Himalayas to Tibet.
So the Mahayana is like
later dissemination
of the Buddhist thought. I mean, you said that.
Well, the theory, that the Buddha taught this. It's not like someone later made it up.
So
this is all teachings of the Buddha.
So how come you didn't?
Because he taught different things to different people depending on capacity. So for most people, he taught this because it was understandable. When we start to look at this, not easy. It's very difficult to understand. So he didn't teach this to many people, only isolated. That's why it took some time for it to slowly grow and develop. Whereas this is much more approachable for the average person, and that's what started to really spread widely initially.
So first it passed orally?
Yeah, so yes, I'm not a historian, but the starting to written down was sort of after the time.
200 years or so after, or later?
Well, written down, I don't know, but it was later, certainly. I don't know if it was written by the time it was spreading to Sri Lanka or...
So we don't even know in what language Buddha...
Not really. I think there are different assertions, but I think it was neither Pali or Sanskrit. It was probably in some local dialect. But I think, again, there are different assertions about that. Okay. Yeah.
What does Theravada mean? Is it Pali or...
Terra means like an elder, like a tribal elder, the wise man of the tribe. And I think Vada means like system of the elders, something like that.
What is that?
And Mahayana, Maha means great, and Yana means vehicle. Vehicle, yeah.
The correlation or to yoga, to the Patanjali Sutra?
Oh, I've not studied, so I'm...
Yoga is the same... I don't know what is the correlation between...
I think, what we're going to look at a little bit tomorrow is that these systems of teachings, from that we have at least 2 philosophical systems evolving in India. And from these system of teachings, and there were another set of teachings which I left out because we don't really need to worry about them in the context of this retreat. But there were another system of teachings taught as well. And from those, we have 2 more philosophical systems evolving. This one that we're going to be following, the philosophical system that really describes this is called Madhyamika. Which literally means middle way school. But, so these are the 4 philosophical systems that we find in Buddhism. But I'm not sure about the Patanjali, what the sort of philosophy, I think it's...
I don't understand what is samadhi in yoga and samadhi here.
Yeah. So samadhi, again, I think in that system has a little bit different connotation, that word samadhi, than here. So I don't think it means exactly the same thing. So we'd have to look closely.
The cessation of the איך אומרים? Of the cessation, this is yoga.
Yeah, that, I mean, samadhi in Buddhist context, it just means concentration. We're not really talking about cessation. Although at higher levels, then certain mental factors, of course, cease, but that's not really the sense of the word samadhi. Sorry?
Samadhi is equal to nirvana or
Moksha. I mean,
Nirvana or what?
moksha, liberation, yeah.
but it's not enlightenment anymore.
Yeah.
It's not. It's a minute. Kind of.
It's like life is about only the nirvana, only the liberation.
Any last questions before, otherwise we'll wrap up slowly?
What about the Sakya?
Yeah, Sakya, I've only studied these three, so actually another point on that is how to differentiate. So in terms of emptiness, I'm not sure what their focus is, but another way to distinguish these schools, and we'll see this a little bit when we go to this nature of mind practice on day 9, is that a little bit the perspective is that Golok school has the perspective, and we see that in the term Lam Rim, stages of the path to enlightenment, has the perspective of where we are now as an ordinary person. There's the goal of enlightenment. These are the practices, the stages I need to go through to get to that goal. So we're, from a Lam Rim Golok perspective, we're looking forward on the spiritual path. Here we are, these are the practices we need to do to get to that goal of enlightenment. Whereas Dzogchen Mahamudra have the exact opposite perspective. They have the perspective of doing the practices from the enlightened state, and then doing everything from that perspective. So, whereas the Sakya, I've heard, is a little bit the in-between. It's a sort of, from the perspective of a yogi, sort of partway along the path. The practices are done from that perspective. And we'll see more about...
What is easier?
Easier, the one that works best for you is easier. Like, for example, both this perspective and this perspective have advantages and disadvantages. With the Golok perspective, you know, we have a perspective, here I am, there's the goal, but wow, that goal is so far away, I have to do all of this stuff. Impossible, I give up, too hard. Whereas this perspective, and we see that in this term Buddha nature, from a Golok perspective, Buddha nature means I have the potential for enlightenment. Whereas in Dzogchen Mahamudra, Buddha nature means there is a Buddha within already. The disadvantage of that, of course, is I don't need to do anything. There's a Buddha already here. So we do nothing. I'm already enlightened. So a little bit I use the perspective here, and both are valid perspectives, and both have advantages and disadvantages. And the way I describe the differences there also, one way is like, you know, if we have a window and it's got some dirt on it, often our perspective is, there's a dirty window, I need to put effort to make it clean. No, valid. But we could equally say, actually there's already a clean window there, I just need to remove the dirt to discover the clean window that was always there. Valid. But based on those two perspectives has a big influence on the way we do practice. And both have advantages and disadvantages. And we'll see a little bit the difference when we go into this emptiness practice with respect to the person, and the emptiness practice with respect to the mind later. Okay. There was a couple more things, but I think that's enough for this evening. I'll add them a little bit tomorrow. Let's leave it there then. Let's finish with the Shavasana meditation again. Allowing your awareness to descend into the body. And simply becoming aware of sensations throughout the body. Using the out breath to relax and release any tightness or tension in any part of the body. And softening and relaxing all the muscles in the face. In this way, allowing the entire body to become completely relaxed, completely at ease.